The wedding planner's earpiece crackled at 4:47 p.m., 13 minutes before the ceremony was set to begin. A woman in a gray wool coat, too heavy for early June, walked past the guest check-in table without giving a name. She carried no purse, no phone, only a folded paper napkin pressed flat inside her coat pocket, the kind handed out at diners that charge $2 for coffee. She did not sit in the overflow section at the back, where 3 folding chairs had been added that morning for a cousin's +1 who never confirmed. She walked down the outer aisle, past 200 guests in tailored silk and pressed linen, until she reached the 4th row on the groom's side. She sat down in a chair reserved for a second cousin still stuck in traffic on the causeway. The head usher, a young man named Peter Collins who had staffed 11 weddings that season alone, approached her with the practiced smile reserved for people who had wandered into the wrong event. "Ma'am, I think there's been some confusion about seating." She did not look at him. She looked instead at the altar, at the arch of white orchids flown in from a greenhouse 3 states away, at the string quartet tuning under a canopy of lights strung across a lawn that cost more per day than most people's monthly rent. "I know exactly where I am," she said. Peter radioed the planner. The planner radioed security. Security did not move yet, because security answered to one person before anyone else, and that person was standing 80 feet away in a charcoal suit that had been fitted 3 times, adjusting a cufflink that did not need adjusting. His name was James Alden Whitmore, 38 years old, founder and chief executive of a cloud infrastructure company whose servers quietly carried a fifth of the continent's internet traffic without most of the continent knowing his name. Net worth north of $3 billion, though the number moved so often his own accountants had stopped repeating it aloud. In 11 minutes, he was going to marry a woman named Charlotte Bennett, and in that moment, standing behind a curtain of white silk with his hands cold despite the June heat, he was thinking about none of it, because his security chief had just leaned in close. "There's a woman here." James did not ask which woman. Weddings like this one had 400 women in attendance. He asked instead, without knowing why the question rose in him before any other, "What is she wearing?" The security chief hesitated, because it was an unusual thing to ask. "Gray coat. Old. She's got something in her hand. Looks like a napkin." James's hand, the one adjusting the cufflink, stopped moving entirely. "Stay with me until the end of this one, because what happens in the next 20 minutes is going to unravel something that took 31 years to bury. And if you've ever wondered whether the people we lose sometimes come back looking nothing like we remember them, you're going to want to see how this ends. While you're here, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. It helps more than you'd think, knowing how far a story like this travels. And if stories about family, forgiveness, and the people we never stop waiting for mean something to you, go ahead and subscribe now, because there's a new one waiting every evening. To understand why the sight of a folded paper napkin could stop a billionaire's hand mid-motion, you have to go back to a kitchen in a mill town outside Scranton, 31 years before that wedding, where a 5-year-old boy sat on a countertop while his father packed a single duffel bag. James's father, Robert Whitmore, was not a cruel man, but he was a man who had decided, somewhere around James's 4th birthday, that grief was a debt best paid in silence. James's mother had left. That was the official version, the one repeated at holiday tables, and in the one interview Robert ever gave a local paper before the company grew large enough to attract attention. She left. She couldn't handle it. She wasn't built for a family. Robert worked as a machinist at a bearing plant that ran 3 shifts, and for the first 6 years after she left, James was raised largely by a rotating cast of neighbors, a great-aunt with a bad hip, and eventually a television set left running so the apartment wouldn't feel as quiet as it was. Robert was not affectionate, but he was consistent, and consistency, to a boy who had already lost one parent, felt close enough to love that James never learned to tell the difference. By 14, James was fixing neighbors' computers for cash after school. By 16, he was reading networking manuals under a blanket with a flashlight because the electric bill didn't stretch to leaving a lamp on past 10. By 19, he had dropped out of a state college 2 credits shy of a degree to build server racks in a rented garage with a friend from his dormitory named Thomas Reed, who believed, as James did, that the internet's next fortune wouldn't be built on software, but on the unglamorous infrastructure underneath it. The cables, the cooling systems, the scaffolding nobody thought to notice until it failed. Thomas handled outreach. James handled the machines. For 3 years, they slept in shifts on a pair of army cots in the garage, splitting a single truck between them, promising each other that if one of them made it out first, he wouldn't leave the other behind. 14 months before their first real contract closed, Thomas forged James's signature on a supplier loan, drained the operating account, and disappeared to the coast with a woman James had never met. What James was left with was a debt collector's letterhead, 3 unpaid contractors, and a silence from Thomas's family that told him everything he needed to know about how long it had been planned. James never spoke publicly about what that betrayal did to him, but the people who worked closest to the company over the following decade could feel its architecture in everything he built. Every hire went through 3 rounds of vetting. Every partnership carried an exit clause drafted before the ink dried on the entry clause. Every friendship, if it could be called that, had a ceiling James set before the other person had the chance to climb past it. He called it discipline. His father, on one of the rare nights he called to check in, called it something else. "You're building yourself a very expensive way to be alone," Robert said once, near the end of his life, in a voice roughened by the emphysema that would take him within the year. "Your mother would have told you the same thing, if she'd stuck around long enough." James let that comment sit in the room without responding to it. He did not ask his father what his mother would have said, because in 30 years he had never once heard his father describe her as a person who might have had things to say. She was a decision that had been made, a door that had been closed, and James had grown into a man who treated closed doors as settled matters. Until, at 38, standing behind a curtain of white silk on the biggest lawn his money could rent, a stranger in a gray coat sat down in the 4th row holding a folded paper napkin, and something in his chest reached backward 31 years before his mind had time to stop it. Her name was Eleanor Grace Whitfield, though almost no one in that garden that evening, including the groom, would learn that name for another 40 minutes. Eleanor was born in a row house in a coal town that had stopped mining coal 2 generations before she arrived, the third of 6 children to a mother who cleaned offices at night and a father who repaired shoes in a shop that no longer exists. She met Robert Whitmore at 19, at a dance hall above a hardware store, and married him at 21 in a ceremony that cost less than the flowers alone would cost at her son's wedding decades later. For the first 18 months, their marriage was ordinary in the way most struggling marriages are ordinary, tight on money, thin on sleep, occasionally warm in the way 2 young people can be warm when they still believe the hardest years are temporary. James was born in the 2nd year. Eleanor named him after her own father, a man who had died the winter before, still smelling of shoe polish and rubber cement even in the casket. What almost no one in James's adult life ever knew, what Robert had made certain no one ever knew, was that 18 months after James's birth, Eleanor began experiencing episodes that, in that town, in that decade, had no gentle name attached to them yet. She would disappear for stretches of the day and return unable to say where she had been. She stopped sleeping for days at a stretch, then slept for 2 days straight and could not be woken. Robert took her to a doctor exactly once. The doctor used the word schizoaffective, a term Robert did not understand and did not ask to have explained, because understanding it would have meant admitting there was something to manage rather than something to hide. What followed was not framed to Eleanor as treatment. It was framed as a decision already made on her behalf, a stay at a state facility 200 miles away, arranged quietly through a cousin who worked in its administration. By the time Eleanor was lucid enough to understand what had happened, custody paperwork Robert had filed in the interim had already been signed by a judge who saw a struggling young mother with a documented psychiatric episode and a stable, employed father, and made the decision that decade almost always made in cases like hers. Eleanor was released 14 months later, stabilized on medication that would take another decade of trial and error to get right, and she returned to the row house to find Robert and James gone, the address changed, the phone disconnected, and a lawyer's letter waiting at her sister's house informing her that contact was, per a judge's order, she barely remembered agreeing to sign under duress, not in the best interest of the child. She was 26 years old. For the next 3 decades, Eleanor Whitfield lived a life that never again touched the version of it that had once included a husband and a 2-year-old boy named for a shoemaker. She worked as a laundry attendant, then a hospital orderly. Then, after a second hospitalization in her 40s cost her the job and the apartment that came with it. She spent 11 months without a fixed address, sleeping in a church basement 3 nights a week and a women's shelter the other 4, carrying everything she owned in 2 canvas totes, because a suitcase, she said once to a caseworker, makes it look like you're planning on staying somewhere, and I never got to plan on that. Again, in the United States today, researchers estimate that women experiencing chronic homelessness are diagnosed with a serious mental illness at more than 4 times the rate of the general population, and fewer than a third of those women maintain any ongoing contact with children from whom they were separated during a hospitalization or crisis period. Those numbers rarely make it into a courtroom transcript. They live instead in things like canvas totes and folded paper napkins kept for 31 years because they once had a mother's handwriting on them before the ink faded past reading. Eleanor found permanent housing again at 51 through a supportive living program that paired stabilized medication with subsidized rent. And it was there, in a one-room apartment above a laundromat in a town 4 hours from the one she'd been born in, that a caseworker named Margaret Hale helped her attempt something Eleanor had never, in 30 years, believed she had the right to try: search for her son. It took Margaret 11 months of records requests, a name change James had made at 22 when he legally added his mother's maiden name as a middle name without ever telling anyone why, and one lucky break. An old family friend of Robert's who still lived in the mill town and remembered, vaguely, a woman named Eleanor who used to sing to a colicky baby on the porch steps at 2 in the morning. By the time Margaret found a verified current address for James Alden Whitmore, he was worth more money than Eleanor could picture as a real number, and his engagement to a woman named Charlotte Bennett had just been announced in a business magazine Margaret printed out at the library, because Eleanor didn't own a computer. Eleanor did not write to him. She had, by then, spent 3 decades learning that letters from her got returned unopened, back when Robert was alive to intercept them, and old habits calcify into certainty even after the reason for them is gone. Instead, she asked Margaret to help her find the wedding date, which was public information printed alongside the engagement announcement, and on a Tuesday in early June, she took a bus for 6 hours with the last of a small disability check in her coat pocket, wearing the only coat she owned, gray and too heavy for the season, carrying nothing but a folded paper napkin she had kept since James was 2 years old, the one on which she had once written, in the shaking hand of a young mother. Learning her letters were about to be taken from her, 3 words she never got the chance to say to him out loud: I did not leave. She did not know, walking onto that lawn, whether her son would recognize her at all. She had aged 31 years since the only photograph he might remember her from. She only knew that if she did not sit in that 4th row and let herself be seen, she would spend the rest of her life the way she had spent the last 3 decades of it, as a decision someone else had made about who deserved a place in a room. Peter's radio crackled again. She won't move, and honestly, I don't think I should make her. The security chief looked toward James, waiting for an instruction that would let this resolve quietly. James did not give it. Instead, he stepped past the curtain of white silk 11 minutes before his own wedding was set to begin, in full view of 400 guests, and walked down the outer aisle toward a woman holding a folded paper napkin in both hands like it was something that might still tear if she gripped it wrong. He stopped 3 feet from her chair. Up close, he could see her hands were shaking, not from age but from the particular tremor that comes from a body bracing for a door to close again. She looked up at him, and whatever she had rehearsed on the 6-hour bus ride left her completely, because his eyes were, unmistakably, her own father's eyes, passed down through a son she had not been permitted to watch grow into them. You have my father's shoe shop eyes, she said, before she could stop herself, and then immediately looked down, as if she had said too much, too fast, 31 years too late. James did not answer right away. He was looking, instead, at her hands, at the napkin folded into a small, worn square with edges gone soft as cloth. Something about the shape of it pulled at a memory so old it had no language attached to it. Only a feeling. A porch, late at night, a voice humming something low over the sound of cicadas, a hand smoothing a blanket that smelled like fabric softener. Who are you? He asked, and it was not a challenge. It was the question of a man who already suspected the answer and was afraid of what accepting it would cost him in the next 11 minutes. She unfolded the napkin with hands that would not fully steady and held it out to him rather than answer directly, because 30 years of being disbelieved had taught her that proof mattered more than declarations. On the fading blue ink were 3 words a mother had written down before the state took away every chance she had to say them in person. "I did not leave." James read it twice. Behind him, the string quartet had stopped tuning. Charlotte Bennett, sensing the shift in the crowd's attention, had stepped partway from behind her own curtain of silk and was watching her fiancé stand motionless in the 4th row. "My mother is dead," James said, but the words came out smaller than he intended. "She left," my father said. "Your father," Eleanor said, and there was no bitterness in it. Only exhaustion so old it had worn itself smooth. "Made a decision about me in a hospital room I wasn't lucid enough to argue against, and then made sure I never got close enough to argue against it again." The garden had gone almost entirely silent. For 100 guests who had come to watch 2 people promise each other permanence were instead watching a man in a tailored charcoal suit lower himself into the empty seat beside his mother, because his legs, for the first time in longer than he could remember, did not feel capable of holding the rest of him upright. What followed did not happen the way weddings and magazines are supposed to unfold. Charlotte Bennett, to her enormous credit, walked down the aisle herself in her gown, past caterers holding trays they no longer knew whether to serve, and knelt in front of the 4th row rather than waiting at the altar for an explanation. She looked at James, then at the woman beside him, then back at James, and asked only one question. "Do you need today to still be today?" James did not answer for nearly a full minute. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse in a way none of his employees, none of his board members, none of the 400 guests had ever heard from him before. "I need to know if this is true first." Charlotte nodded, stood, and turned to the assembled guests. She announced, in a clear voice that did not waver, that the ceremony would be postponed, not canceled, and that everyone was welcome to stay for the dinner that had already been paid for, because grief and joy, she said, had never been very good at waiting for separate rooms. "If a story like this is pulling at something in you right now, stay with me, because there's still more ahead, including the part where James has to decide, in front of everyone he has ever built a life around, whether 31 years of one version of the truth can survive meeting the other." Drop a like if you believe some doors deserve to be reopened even decades later. The following 6 weeks were not the tidy montage a story like this might promise. James hired a private investigator not to challenge his mother's claim, but to understand, finally, the paper trail his father had spent 3 decades ensuring he would never see. What the investigator found matched, almost exactly, what Eleanor had already told him in a 10-minute conversation in a folding chair on a rented lawn. A psychiatric hold Robert had arranged through a cousin, a custody filing pushed through a sympathetic judge while Eleanor was still under sedation, a return mail stamp on 11 letters Eleanor had sent over the following 4 years, each one intercepted and destroyed before James, then a child of 6, 7, 8 years old, could have ever known they existed. James confronted the version of his father that lived only in memory now, because Robert had died 9 years earlier, and there was no longer a living man to answer for any of it. Only a folder of documents, a name in a hospital ledger, and a mother sitting across a kitchen table in the small apartment above a laundromat, which James visited 17 times in that first 6 weeks, more than he had visited his father's grave in the 9 years since Robert died. He learned, over those visits, the parts of his mother's life that had never made it into any court filing. That she had, in the years right after her release, sent birthday cards to an address that no longer existed because no one had told her it had changed, and had kept every returned envelope in a shoebox rather than throw them away, because a returned envelope, unopened, still meant the attempt had been made. That she had, during her 11 months without an address, still asked shelter staff twice a year whether they had any way to search for a boy who would have been growing into a teenager, then a young man, somewhere she could not picture. Nationally, fewer than 15% of parents who lose custody during a psychiatric crisis are ever granted formal reunification, even after full stabilization, because the legal architecture built around those cases rarely revisits its own assumptions once a judgment has been entered. Eleanor's case was not unusual in its outcome. What was unusual was that 31 years later, the outcome reversed itself at all. James did not rebuild the relationship with grand gestures, though he could have afforded almost any gesture imaginable. He learned, instead, the smaller things his money had never been able to buy him access to. That his mother took her coffee black because sugar, during her leanest years, had felt like a luxury she'd trained herself out of wanting. That she still hummed, without noticing she was doing it, the same low tune he had half remembered on a porch he'd been told for 31 years had never included her. "I want a say in it," she told him. The fourth time he offered to simply solve her housing with a signature and a transfer. "Not a bigger apartment I didn't choose. A say." So instead, James funded, anonymously, an expansion of the supportive housing program that had first helped stabilize her, in the town where she'd spent those 11 months without an address. He did not put his name on the building. He put hers, quietly, on a small brass plaque near the entrance that read "Only," in honor of every mother a system decided to stop looking for. Charlotte Bennett did not walk away from the postponed wedding, though she told James plainly, in the weeks that followed, that she needed him to understand something before she agreed to reschedule it. "I don't want to marry a man who's spent his whole life afraid that everyone eventually disappears," she said. "I watched you finally stop being afraid of one specific disappearance. I need to know that changes something, not just for her. For us." It did, slowly, the way real change tends to happen rather than the way it happens in the stories told about it afterward. James began, for the first time in his adult life, letting people closer than the perimeter he had built since Thomas Reed disappeared with the company's operating account. He rewrote, on his own initiative, the exit clauses in 3 long-standing business relationships that had been drafted out of a fear that had nothing to do with the people currently on the other side of them. The wedding took place 4 months later than originally planned, on a smaller lawn, with a give take from either of them. Perhaps the hardest part of a story like this isn't the reunion. It's the 31 years in between, where a woman kept a folded napkin soft with handling, believing, against every piece of evidence a system handed her, that someday it might still matter to someone. Not every door that closes stays closed, and not every person who disappears from a story chose to leave it. Sometimes the person still standing on the other side of that door has simply been waiting for someone to finally check .st list cut by half, because James had asked, this time, for a ceremony that felt like a room rather than a production. Eleanor sat in the front row, not the fourth, in a navy blue dress Charlotte had helped her choose on a shopping trip that took most of an afternoon, because Eleanor kept apologizing for taking too long to decide, a habit 30 years of having no say in anything had worn into her without her noticing. When the officiant asked, as is customary, whether anyone present wished to say a few words before the vows, James turned first, not to Charlotte, but to the front row where his mother now sat, and said the only thing he had spent 4 months learning how to say, without his voice breaking in the middle of it. "I spent 31 years believing a door had been closed by someone who chose to walk away from it. It turns out the door was closed by someone else, and the person on the other side of it never stopped standing there." He held up, for a moment, a small paper napkin, worn soft as cloth at its folds, now kept in a frame at his office rather than a shoebox in a shelter. "I did not leave. Neither did you. It just took both of us 3 decades to find that out." Eleanor did not say anything in return, because she could not, but she reached forward from the front row and took her son's hand the way she had once, on a porch step at 2 in the morning, held a colicky infant who had no idea yet what the coming decades would. If Eleanor's story reminded you of someone you love, a parent, a sibling, a friend you lost touch with under circumstances that were never really their fault, type their first name in the comments below. Nothing else, just the name. You'd be surprised how many people scrolling through tonight are looking for the exact nudge to finally reach out to someone they've been afraid to call. And if this story kept you here until the last line, that's exactly the kind of story we tell on this channel every single evening. Real people, quiet choices, and the moments that change everything after. Hit subscribe now so you don't miss the next one. Tap the bell so you're notified the second it goes live. And if you've got 60 seconds left, drop a like on your way out. It's the single easiest way to help a story like this reach someone else who needs it tonight. Thank you for staying until the very last word. I'll see you in the next one.